The morning of June 4th, 1942, began like many others in the vast Pacific. The sea shimmered in the sunlight, calm and deceptively peaceful. But above it, contrails scarred the sky. From the east, American dive bombers plunged toward the Japanese carrier strike force. Engines screamed as they entered their dives, the roar of propellers merging with the shriek of wind. Below, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy steamed forward. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These carriers were the same juggernauts that had unleashed devastation at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Now, their decks bustled with activity, crews rearming aircraft, fueling bombers, and preparing for a second wave of strikes against Midway Atoll. To Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the plan was unfolding perfectly. America would be drawn into his trap. Then came the shadows. American SBD dauntless dive bombers, guided by fate and chance, broke through thin cloud cover. Their pilots rolled into steep dives, the sun flashing off their wings. One aviator later recalled the moment. "I saw the great gray decks below, and I knew. This was it." At 10:22 a.m., the first bomb slammed into Kaga. Explosions ripped across her deck as fueled aircraft ignited. A second strike struck Akagi, engulfing the carrier in a fireball. Within minutes, the heart of Japan's naval air power was in flames. Eyewitnesses described sailors hurling themselves into the sea to escape the inferno, while officers stood stunned, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The Pacific, once a theater of Japanese dominance, now echoed with the sound of steel tearing apart and munitions detonating. For the first time, the mighty carrier fleet of Japan appeared vulnerable. For the Americans, it was a moment of redemption. Just half a year earlier, the nation had reeled from the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. Battleships lay in ruins, sailors buried beneath twisted steel, and the myth of invincible Japanese power loomed over the Pacific. In Tokyo, leaders had celebrated, convinced that America lacked the resolve for a long war. Newspapers derided U.S. industry as bloated and soulless, mass-producing machines inferior to the spirit-driven warriors of Japan. But on this day, those same machines, the dive bombers, the carriers, the torpedoes forged on American assembly lines, struck with unrelenting precision. Flames climbed higher aboard Akagi and Kaga. Thick black smoke coiled into the sky, visible for miles. The Japanese sailors who had once cheered their victories now faced the unthinkable. One survivor later wrote that the heat was unbearable, the sky raining fire and steel. "We knew then the battle was lost, though the war would go on." For Admiral Chester Nimitz and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Midway was not only a chance to halt Japan's advance, but also an opportunity to prove that the sacrifices since Pearl Harbor had meaning. Behind every bomb dropped was the labor of welders in San Diego, riveters in Kansas, and machinists in Detroit. America's strength was not just in its weapons, but in the vast network of people who produced them. The Battle of Midway had only just begun, yet within these fiery minutes lay its essence. Japan's supreme confidence collided with America's resolve. A war once tilted toward Tokyo now teetered on a knife's edge. In 4 days of battle, the balance of the Pacific would be rewritten. But here, in the opening strikes, the world glimpsed what was to come. The unraveling of Japan's naval supremacy, undone not by chance alone, but by intelligence, courage, and the relentless power of industry. The flames that consumed the Japanese carriers on June 4th were more than the destruction of ships. They were the first sparks of a reversal that would echo across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, until the rising sun set in defeat. And as the smoke drifted into the endless sky, a single truth emerged. This was the beginning of the end for Japan's empire at sea. The story of Midway could not be understood without first retracing the thunderous path of Japan's early victories. In December 1941, the world watched in shock as Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in less than 2 hours. Battleships burned in the shallow waters of Oahu, and over 2,400 Americans perished. To Tokyo, the attack was more than a triumph of arms. It was a declaration that the rising sun now ruled the Pacific. The momentum did not stop there. In the months that followed, Japanese forces stormed across Asia and the Pacific with astonishing speed. The impregnable fortress of Singapore fell in February 1942, surrendering over 80,000 British troops in one of the empire's darkest hours. The Philippines followed soon after. American and Filipino defenders on Bataan and Corregidor, exhausted and undersupplied, succumbed to overwhelming pressure. In the Dutch East Indies, Japan seized vital oil reserves, securing the resources it needed to fuel its war machine. From Tokyo's perspective, the empire appeared unstoppable. Newspapers glorified the samurai spirit of its soldiers and aviators, while political leaders described the United States as a decadent nation unfit for protracted struggle. Japanese commanders boasted that they could dictate the pace of the war, their battle-hardened warriors sweeping aside a nation of mechanics untested in real hardship. Yet across the Pacific, the seeds of resistance had already taken root. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, surveyed the wreckage at Pearl Harbor with steely determination. The fleet had been battered, but not broken. Aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown remained afloat, and with them, the possibility of striking back. Nimitz quietly set about rebuilding American strength, relying on industry, intelligence, and a willingness to take risks that Japan did not expect. The first cracks in Japan's aura of invincibility came at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers, it was the first battle in naval history where opposing ships never saw each other. American aviators sank the carrier Shoho and badly damaged Shokaku, while the Yorktown suffered heavy blows. Though costly, the clash proved a critical lesson. Japan could be checked, and the carrier, not the battleship, was now the true instrument of naval supremacy. One U.S. pilot later remarked, "At Coral Sea, we learned that they could bleed just like we could." For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Coral Sea was a setback but not a defeat. He envisioned a larger gamble that would restore Japan's dominance. His plan was elegant in conception: lure the battered remnants of the U.S. fleet into a trap at Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. By seizing Midway, Japan would extend its defensive perimeter and destroy America's carriers in a single decisive blow. To Tokyo, it seemed the logical continuation of their winning streak. But Yamamoto's plan rested on dangerous assumptions. He believed American morale remained fragile, that the Pacific Fleet was too weak to risk open battle, and that his own communications remained secure. In reality, U.S. Navy cryptographers in Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo had broken portions of Japan's naval code. Through painstaking analysis, they identified AF, the target of Yamamoto's next offensive, as Midway itself. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz prepared an ambush of his own. While Yamamoto expected to surprise a timid enemy, it would be Japan that sailed into the jaws of a waiting fleet. The stage was set. Japan, confident in its warriors and traditions, sought to finish the war in a single stroke. America, underestimated and bloodied but unbroken, quietly sharpened its blades. The next clash would last 4 days. It would decide not just the fate of Midway, but the course of the entire Pacific War. Beneath the tropical sun of Oahu, in a dim, airless basement at Pearl Harbor, a small group of men labored in near anonymity. Their weapons were not rifles or torpedoes, but pencils, typewriters, and endless streams of intercepted Japanese radio signals. This was Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalytic unit, and its chief, Commander Joseph Rockefort, believed that inside these garbled strings of numbers and characters lay the key to Japan's next great offensive. The code was JN-25, a complex system of 5-digit groups changed periodically by the Japanese Navy. Breaking it was a task that consumed thousands of hours, with no guarantee of success. Yet by the spring of 1942, Rockefort's team had begun to make progress. Piece by painstaking piece, they reconstructed phrases, ship movements, and logistical requests. The fragments did not yet form a full picture, but they pointed towards something monumental. Japan was planning a strike in the Central Pacific against a location designated only as AF. What AF represented, however, was a matter of debate. Some believed it could mean Hawaii, others suggested points further south. Rockefort was convinced it meant Midway Atoll. To prove it, he devised a ruse. Midway was ordered to broadcast an uncoded message complaining of a water shortage. Days later, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. The target was confirmed. This revelation gave Admiral Chester Nimitz the one advantage every commander craved: foreknowledge. While Admiral Yamamoto's grand plan assumed surprise, the Americans would be waiting. Nimitz now knew not only the objective, but the approximate timing and strength of Japan's attack. He quietly concentrated his three available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to lie in ambush northeast of Midway. Meanwhile, on the atoll itself, preparations intensified. Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors labored under the relentless sun, stacking sandbags, laying barbed wire, and strengthening runways. Anti-aircraft guns sprouted like iron weeds, their crews drilling constantly. Pilots of Marine Corps squadrons flew outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, knowing their chances against Japan's Zero fighters were slim. Still, they readied themselves with grim determination. One Marine aviator later recalled, "We didn't think of winning. We thought of holding long enough to give the fleet a chance." Inside Station Hypo, the strain showed on the faces of cryptanalysts. Eyewitnesses described long nights bent over reams of paper, fueled by coffee and exhaustion, as they combed through intercepted chatter for any hint of Japan's intentions. The stakes could not have been higher. Each fragment of code might mean the difference between ambush and disaster. When the confirmation of Midway came through, one sailor remembered the surge of relief in the cramped room. "We knew then that our months of grinding effort had not been in vain. We had given our fleet the eyes to see." In Tokyo, Japanese planners remained supremely confident. They assumed that after Coral Sea, the American carriers were crippled or cautious. Yamamoto believed that his fleet, built around four powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would overwhelm any opposition. He spread his forces across a vast arc, trusting numerical superiority and the element of surprise. What he could not know was that the veil of secrecy had already been torn away. As May turned to June, two very different preparations unfolded across the Pacific. In Japan, crews loaded munitions, painted banners, and expected another victory to rival Pearl Harbor. At Midway, defenders dug foxholes into coral rock, aircraft revved on crude runways, and lookouts scanned the endless horizon. In Pearl Harbor's basement, men hunched over radios and typewriters, straining to catch the next clue in the ether. The battle to come would hinge not only on steel and courage, but on the silent war of intellect. In the shadows of Station Hypo, America had seized a priceless advantage, an advantage that would soon set the stage for 4 days that changed the course of the Pacific War. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, casting pale light across the low coral sands of Midway Atoll. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched their opening blow. More than 100 aircraft, bombers, dive bombers, and Zero escorts rose into the sky, their engines droning like a swarm of locusts. Minutes later, the air raid sirens wailed over Midway. Marines scrambled from foxholes, anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward, and pilots sprinted to their waiting aircraft. The first bombs fell just after sunrise. Runways shattered under direct hits, fuel depots exploded into fireballs, and hangars erupted in flames. Thick black smoke climbed into the sky, smothering the atoll in the stench of burning fuel. Despite their outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, U.S. Marine aviators launched to meet the attackers head-on. It was a slaughter. Entire squadrons were cut to pieces by experienced Zero pilots. One survivor later recalled, "We were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. We just kept climbing into the fight until there was nothing left." The defense was desperate, yet it was not in vain. Japanese bombers failed to neutralize Midway completely. The runways, though cratered, remained usable. Ammunition stores and critical facilities survived. Japanese commanders realized a second strike would be necessary, an order that would later prove catastrophic. Even as Midway burned, Admiral Chester Nimitz's trap was springing into action. From the northeast, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already launching their own counterstrikes. Waves of planes clawed into the sky, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, sent to locate and cripple the Japanese fleet. The first to arrive were the torpedo squadrons, flying obsolete TBD devastators. Slow, underarmed, and poorly protected, they pressed on with grim resolve. One after another, they dove low and straight, lining up for attack runs against the Japanese carriers. Zeros pounced from above, cutting into their formations with deadly precision. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, shredding wings and igniting fuel tanks. The losses were staggering. Of the 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, not a single one returned. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours in the sea, watching as the battle raged overhead. Other squadrons fared little better. Pilots described the nightmare of flying into walls of tracers, their radios filled with frantic cries cut short mid-sentence. It felt like flying into hell itself, one survivor later recalled. Yet their sacrifice achieved something no one could have planned. By forcing the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, the torpedo squadrons pulled away the protective curtain of Zeros. Above, the skies were suddenly clear, an opening that would soon prove decisive. On the Japanese carriers, chaos reigned. Pilots and deck crews prepared for the second strike against Midway, hauling bombs and torpedoes across decks slick with sweat and fuel. The hangars were crowded with armed aircraft, waiting for orders that shifted from moment to moment. Rearm for land targets. No, rearm for ships. This constant indecision left the carriers' decks littered with explosives, making them tinderboxes for disaster. Meanwhile, Midway's defenders still clung on. Marine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Craters and smoke covered the island, but the stars and stripes still flew defiantly above command posts. Every minute bought by their resistance gave the approaching U.S. strike groups precious time. As the morning wore on, the Japanese could not know that their moment of triumph was slipping away. They had bloodied Midway, destroyed dozens of American aircraft, and annihilated torpedo squadrons. But in doing so, they had set the stage for the blow that would decide the battle. The sky above the Pacific shimmered with heat and smoke. Contrails from dogfights twisted like scars across the blue. On both sides, men braced for what would come next. The opening strikes had been brutal, but the decisive moment was still to come. The morning of June 4, 1942, had already been brutal. Midway smoldered under black columns of smoke, and entire U.S. torpedo squadrons had been annihilated. For the Japanese, it seemed the battle was unfolding as planned. Their carriers, though pressed, still stood as the most formidable striking force in the Pacific. Yet beneath the calm surface of command bridges, their decks were dangerously exposed, crowded with fueled planes and bombs waiting to be loaded. At 10:20 a.m., fate arrived. From high above the cloud layers, U.S. Navy dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown pierced the skies. The squadrons had nearly missed their target, flying long arcs across the ocean. But at that precise moment, the Japanese combat air patrols had been dragged low, chasing the remnants of the doomed torpedo squadrons. The sky above the fleet was wide open. Like hawks stooping on prey, the dauntless dive bombers rolled into their plunges. From 20,000 feet, they screamed downward, sirens howling, sunlight glinting off wings. Within seconds, bombs began to fall. One officer later described the moment as sudden thunder from a clear sky. Kaga was the first struck. Multiple bombs ripped through her flight deck, igniting fueled aircraft waiting below. Explosions thundered through her hangars, sending geysers of flames skyward. Just minutes later, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was hit. A single bomb penetrated her deck and detonated among armed planes. The resulting inferno engulfed the carrier from bow to stern. Soryu followed, hammered by 3 direct hits that set her ablaze. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were fatally crippled. Eyewitness accounts painted a scene of chaos and despair. Japanese sailors stumbled across decks littered with mangled steel and burning fuel. Many threw themselves into the sea to escape the flames. One survivor recalled the roar of explosions mixing with the screams of wounded men. For commanders who had believed in the invincibility of their fleet, the sight was unthinkable. Yet the battle was not finished. The remaining carrier, Hiryu, still possessed striking power. Rallying her surviving air groups, Japanese commanders launched counterattacks with ruthless determination. Just after noon, her dive bombers located Yorktown. Diving from the sun, they scored multiple hits. Explosions tore through the carrier's decks, knocking out her boilers and halting her engines. Thick smoke rose into the sky as her crew fought desperately to save her. For hours, sailors battled flames with hoses, buckets, and sheer grit. One later remembered the deafening roar of water pumps and the suffocating heat of steel decks underfoot. Against all odds, Yorktown's crew stabilized her, and she remained afloat, battered but defiant. But Hiryu was not finished. A second wave struck later that afternoon, slamming torpedoes into the wounded carrier's side. The blasts ripped open her hull, throwing men into the air. By evening, Yorktown lay crippled, her decks still burning as destroyers circled to protect her. Even as she reeled, American dive bombers were already on their way toward vengeance. Late in the afternoon, planes from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu. Diving out of the clouds, they unleashed their payloads. Direct hits tore into her deck and hangars. Flames engulfed the carrier, consuming her aircraft and ammunition. By nightfall, she too was a burning wreck. The clash had lasted less than a single day, yet its impact was seismic. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone, their aircrews lost, their planes destroyed. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors perished in the infernos. For a navy that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, the loss was catastrophic. The American fleet had suffered as well. Yorktown was mortally wounded, and her crew would eventually abandon her. Dozens of pilots had not returned, their planes swallowed by the sea. Yet the U.S. Navy still held 2 carriers intact, while Japan's strike force had been shattered beyond repair. On Japanese decks, survivors stared in disbelief at the wreckage around them. The invincible codebreakers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was gone. One officer later admitted, "We did not lose simply ships. We lost the war in a single afternoon." The Battle of Midway was not yet over, but by the close of June 4th, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The empire that had swept across the seas with unstoppable force now faced a grim future, its naval supremacy broken in fire and smoke. When the smoke cleared on June 7, 1942, the scale of Japan's disaster was undeniable. For of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay at the bottom of the Pacific, their twisted hulks entombing over 3,000 sailors. Nearly 250 aircraft had been destroyed, along with some of the most experienced pilots and deck crews in the Imperial Navy. By comparison, American losses were painful but not crippling. The Yorktown, struck repeatedly during the battle, finally slipped beneath the waves, taking around 300 men with her. Yet even as her crew mourned, the U.S. Navy still retained 2 operational carriers and, crucially, the industrial capacity to build more. For Japan, the Battle of Midway was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. The codebreakers, the once feared carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor and swept across Asia, was gone. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Japanese Navy since December 1941 vanished in a matter of hours. One surviving officer later admitted that the loss struck at the very heart of our fighting spirit. The most devastating blow, however, was not the loss of ships but of men. Japan's naval aviators represented a warrior elite, trained through years of rigorous programs that emphasized precision, discipline, and sacrifice. They were not easily replaced. Unlike the United States, which would soon be turning out thousands of new pilots each year, Japan lacked both the time and the resources to replenish its losses. The cream of its naval air arm, destroyed at Midway, left a void that could never truly be filled. For the Americans, the victory was electrifying. Only 6 months earlier, the nation had staggered under the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. Now, the tide had begun to turn. Newspapers splashed headlines of triumph. calling Midway the greatest naval victory in history. For the men who had fought it, however, the memories were etched not in glory but in smoke, fire, and sacrifice. Pilots who had seen their comrades fall into the sea, sailors who had battled infernos aboard carriers, and Marines who had defended Midway's shores carried with them scars that headlines could not capture. The strategic impact was clear. Midway ended Japan's ability to launch large-scale offensive operations in the Pacific. No longer could the empire dictate the pace of the war with bold thrusts across the ocean. From this point forward, Japan was forced into a defensive struggle, reacting to the relentless advance of American forces. At the same time, Midway revealed the enduring truth of modern warfare. Battles were not won by spirit alone, but by the marriage of intelligence, industry, and courage. It was American codebreakers in a basement at Pearl Harbor who had given Admiral Nimitz foreknowledge of Yamamoto's plan. It was the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California that ensured replacement planes and carriers would be ready when needed. And it was the bravery of men. Torpedo crews who flew into certain death, dive bombers who plunged through walls of flak, and sailors who refused to abandon their ships, that delivered the final blow. Japan's leaders, reflecting in the aftermath, recognized too late the scale of their miscalculation. They had believed the United States to be soft, its people unprepared for prolonged war. Instead, they discovered an enemy whose industrial strength seemed limitless and whose resolve had only hardened with each loss. One Japanese admiral later remarked that Midway was the point where destiny slipped from our grasp. For the United States, Midway was more than revenge. It was proof that the war could be won. The Pacific was still vast, and countless battles remained to be fought, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. But Midway had provided something priceless: momentum, confidence, and the knowledge that even the mightiest of enemies could be brought low. As the documentary closes, the image lingers: the calm Pacific, broken only by the rising bubbles where great ships once stood. For days of battle had redrawn the map of the war. Japan's empire, which had stretched so confidently across Asia and the Pacific, now faced a long and inevitable retreat. Midway's legacy was clear. Power is fragile, even when cloaked in steel, and victory often belongs not to those who begin strongest, but to those who endure longest. The carriers that burned at Midway marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. From that moment onward, the Pacific belonged not to the empire of Japan, but to the inexhaustible strength of American resolve.